Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from my backyard in Los Angeles, California. How's everyone doing today? I hope you're well, I hope you're happy, healthy, and having a little fun. Today, our Critter Chat is going to talk about an animal that is often confused by many people to possibly be a plant or possibly something else. Today, we're talking about sea anemones. Sea anemones are actually named after a flower that is called the anemone. They have a very similar appearance. I'll see if I can post a photo later today on the Facebook profile of the anemone flower. But they look fairly similar in their structure. But sea anemones are kind of one of those often overlooked, often misunderstood animals that are actually really quite fascinating in a lot of regards of how they live, where they live, and what they do. They are a close relative of coral and jellies. Now, both those animals I've talked about in previous Critter Chats. The coral episode is number 75, and the jellies is number 29, if you want to go back and rewatch or re-listen to those. All of those groups of animals, corals, jellies, and sea anemones, are in a group of animals called Cnidaria. Cnidaria is kind of a big word. It's also spelled really weird, but it is a Latin word for nettle because they all have stinging cells. So they all have the ability to sting other animals. That is what kind of sets them apart from a lot of different species that live in the sea. They all have stinging polyps called nematocysts. And nematocysts are their stinging cells, and they help defend them, but they also really help them collect their food. And that is true across the board with corals, jellies, and sea anemones. With sea anemones, they spend most of their time and most of their lives attached to a rock or the seafloor or a reef of some sort. Now, when they first are little anemones, they're usually part of the zooplankton field, floating around in the ocean as little tiny animals that are a very important food source for many, many other species of animals. And then as they get a little bigger, they usually settle down, and they'll typically stay in one general area for the rest of their life. Although if their environment becomes unlivable, they slowly either slide away. They kind of have a big foot on the bottom, kind of like a snail. And they can use that to move around, although they move slower than snails, typically taking a very long time to move a distance like this far in maybe a day, or 2, or 3, or a week to move that far. But they can totally detach and float away, drift on the current, or they can even pulse once they're released, and that helps them to somewhat swim a little bit. Although similar to a jelly or a jellyfish, they don't really have a lot of control over their direction. If they're trying to move that way, they can just kind of control it. Jellies actually are big floaters, and their pulsing just kind of helps propel them slightly in a certain area. Sea anemones would have even less control over the direction that they move. They spend most of their time as they're attached to a rock or a seafloor, kind of just waiting. Their little tentacles dangling, waiting for a fish or a small ocean animal to come by that would be food for them. Things like shrimp, other little crustaceans, any other little animals that come by, they are looking for that to become food because they are predators. Which seems a little strange because they're a very simple creature, but they are indeed a predator of much more complex organisms like fish. And they're able to do that in a pretty unique way. Each of their little tentacles is covered with hundreds, if not thousands, of little nematocysts, the stinging cells. Those kind of function like a harpoon, and they spear their prey and inject a little tiny bit of something called a neurotoxin. That's a venom that paralyzes their prey, and then they use their tentacles to kind of push their prey into their mouth. So as you look at a sea anemone, you see all the dangly tentacles. In the middle, there's a shape kind of like a belly button. That is their mouth. And so they'll push their prey into their mouth, and then they kind of close up around it, and they'll digest their prey for hours and hours and hours, sometimes like a full day, and then they'll poop it back out. And when they poop it out, it comes out the same way that it went in. Their mouth is also their butt. They are the original potty mouth. In science, we call that a closed digestive system. So think of it kind of like a flower vase. There's only one hole, right? That's the way everything goes in, but it's also the way everything has to come back out. So that is true with jellies as well as their cousins, the sea anemones. So the original potty mouths. They're also pretty simple in their anatomy, what they have, what they don't have. They don't have any bones. They don't have a brain. They don't have eyes or ears or a heart or blood. They pretty much just exist to eat, and that's about it. And reproduce. Sorry, having some connection issues. There are over 1,000 species of sea anemones out there in the world's oceans. They range inside from about a half an inch across up to 6 feet across. I've never seen one anywhere near that size, but allegedly they exist. Some of them live in deep water, up to possibly 10,000 feet deep or more. But most of them are pretty close to the coast or in shallow waters, living on reefs or submerged objects, cliffs, things like that. They are often found in tide pools and close to coastal areas. We got a squirrel running behind us today. Always. Most sea anemones are harmless to people. Their neurotoxin usually just feels a little sticky when we touch them. If you've ever had the opportunity to touch a sea anemone at an aquarium or possibly in a tide pool, you can do so, but do so very safely. Don't poke at it, just lightly touch it. You never want to hurt them, and you want to be very careful with knowing what you're touching before you go touching it, because there are some that can hurt you, particularly some of the tropical sea anemones. So if the water's warm, don't go touching anemones. You don't know if they might be able to hurt you. With sea anemones, their reproduction is extremely interesting in that they can reproduce in a variety of ways, with most species being able to reproduce both sexually and asexually. Asexually means that there's only one individual parent and the babies are all exact clones of the parents. Sexually would mean that there are two parents and their genetic material is a combination of the genes of the parent animals. So asexually, they can do something called budding, and that's where a little piece of them breaks off and kind of floats away and becomes a little baby sea anemone. It would be, again, a genetic clone of its parent. They can also do something called longitudinal fission. That's kind of a big complex word, but what that is as they're growing, instead of being round like most of them, they start to be more oblong shaped, and then it starts to look a little more like a figure 8, and then they actually separate and become two anemones, identically genetically the same and about the same size. There were some at the aquarium when I worked there that were doing this. It was really fascinating to watch it happen and progress. It takes months at a time to slowly form into that shape, and during that time they form two mouths and slowly start to become more figure 8 shaped. Oh, the squirrel's mad today. I don't know why he's mad. Maybe because my dogs are out here too. The other type of asexual reproduction is where they do something called basal laceration. Small pieces break off at the base of the sea anemone, and those form tiny anemones that then float away and become part of the zooplankton and eventually settle down and grow to be bigger. The way most of them reproduce sexually, if they do that, where there are two parent anemones, they broadcast spawn. So that means that one shoots a bunch of eggs out into the water, one shoots a bunch of sperm cells out into the water, and those sperm and eggs, if the parents are close enough, will find each other and then form little babies and become part of the zooplankton and then eventually settle down. So a lot of different ways that they can reproduce. It's super complex, and we're still learning a lot about it, especially their fission operations, how they can split into. Similarly, other animals can sometimes do things kind of like that, like stars, sea stars, which I also talked about in another Critter Chat. Sea anemones are probably best known for their symbiotic relationships. A symbiotic relationship is something biologists describe as a relationship between two species where they both benefit. The most famous of those four sea anemones is a clownfish and a sea anemone. If you've ever seen the movie Finding Nemo, you know that clownfish, like Nemo, live in anemones. And the clownfish gets some protection and has a place to hide from other bigger fish. And the anemone gets somebody to help kind of groom it, to defend it from potential predators that might try to protect it from any predators that may hurt the anemone. And then the anemone also gets to eat all the scraps of whatever the clownfish is eating. They also sometimes have a symbiotic relationship with algae, which is similar to coral, who is their cousin. And that allows the algae to grow in and around the sea anemone. And the anemone benefits by being able to absorb some of the sugars and some of the oxygen that are byproducts of the algae's photosynthesis, while the algae has a safe home to live in. Anemones will sometimes fight with each other. This happens when different species usually are very close to one another, and their tentacles start to kind of compete with one another, and they actually can change their tentacles into little warrior cells that will attack the other anemone's tentacles and damage it. And then they kind of have a scar, and then they have less tentacles in that area. If they are equally sized, they may stay that way for a very long time. If one feels like it is being defeated by the competition, it may move away, either by using its little foot to slowly crawl, taking days to move about several inches away, or it may totally detach and float off. With the species of over 1,000 sea anemones, there's still a lot we do not know, specifically how well they are doing out there in the world's oceans. Some species are thought to be threatened and maybe vulnerable to extinction. None are listed as critically endangered or endangered, but it's mostly because it's data deficient. We haven't studied them enough to know how well their populations are. The ocean's a very difficult place to do adequate census of most animals because they can live in a wide variety of habitats, and the ocean is big, and it's difficult for people to always spend a lot of time in the water studying the animals that live there. Some coastal populations have definitely shown declines in their population due to things like pollution and other ocean problems, things like warmer ocean temperatures, pollution, like I said, oil spills have been a huge issue. Warmer and rising ocean temperatures can cause problems, which would be both associated with climate change, and obviously humans are messing up lots of places in the world. The ocean is certainly one of them. With my experiences with sea anemones, I have on very rare occasions seen some along the coastline here in California. Most of the time when I am at the coast, I'm usually at a sandy beach. That is not their preferred habitat. They're usually more in rocky areas and tidal pool areas. So my experience with them is a bit limited in the wild. During my time when I was employed at the Aquarium of the Pacific, I did see them every day when I worked there, as I often would work at the little touch labs where people were encouraged to touch the sea anemones. it was always super fun to see who was afraid and who was brave to touch the sea anemones, often with children being much more courageous than their parents, or especially than their grandparents. It was super cool to work around sea anemones. It was amazing to see them eat on days that they were fed, which was only about once a week, maybe twice a week for the bigger ones. They would close up real tight after eating their food, and then you would see them poop about a day later. But super interesting to work with anemones. I'll be posting some more information on the Facebook profile later today. That's what I have to share with you today about sea anemones. I hope you've enjoyed it. Until next time, be happy, be healthy, and have some fun. Bye.